In the aftermath of the Great Dying at the end of the Permian period, life on Earth was severely reduced both in diversity and in number, and this was most evident in the oceans, with an estimated 81% of all marine species being suddenly wiped out. This left vacant a great number of niches, and with many of the genera that did end up surviving, some on the land made the transition back to an aquatic lifestyle to take up niches once vacated. A notable group of these animals were the Placodonts, an order of reptiles that ranged markedly in size and form, and were among the earliest reptile groups to colonise aquatic environments after the Permian extinction event. The first specimens collected, being those of their unique teeth, were discovered as early as 1809, with the first skull being found in 1824, though these fossils were initially thought to belong to unusual fish. In 1858, the anatomist Richard Owen instead argued that they represented a new group of animals related to plesiosaurs, and in 1871 were promptly classified under the order Placodontia by Edward Cope. The name Placodontia, which means tablet teeth, will be relevant later when it comes to their method of feeding and niches in their environments, with these animals living from the Middle to Late Triassic and being found from Western Europe to southern China in what was once the expansive Tethys Ocean. They are a small clade, although they were nonetheless diverse, and in the short time they were around were plastic and adaptive, ranging from the marine but non-pelagic to near-coast or lagoonal bathyal feeders. They are most notable for their wide, often armoured bodies, dense bones, and their aforementioned teeth, with them having been variously classified as reptilian analogues of walruses, rays, or as turtle mimics, with the general consensus among paleontologists finding that Placodonts were the most basal members of the superorder Sauropterygia, the marine reptile group that also includes nothosaurs and plesiosaurs, although some place them outside the clade while still being related. Sauropterygians as a whole represented the most successful marine reptile radiation in history, spanning almost the entire Mesozoic and exploiting a wide range of habitats and ecological niches. Sauropterygia is a part of the major reptile group known as the Diapsida, although there is less agreement on where within Diapsida their affinities lie, with some considering them as pantestudines, closer to turtles than to any other animals, which themselves have quite the messy taxonomy. Analysis of fossils and genetic evidence most commonly suggests that they are more closely related to archosaurs, although work in this field is ongoing. Placodonts are divided up into two distinct groups, being the unarmoured Placodontoidea and the armoured cymodontoidea, with Placodontoidea encompassing animals like Placodus, the animal which gives its name to the group, which have a passing resemblance to a barrel-chested marine iguana, being the largest and most familiar species of Placodont living in the early mid-Triassic. Their bodies, as mentioned, were robust and rather square-shaped in cross-section, being relatively unspecialised with little armour, meaning that they were likely marginally more agile when compared to other members of the group. They were also fairly large animals, getting up to 3 meters long, and having long, laterally compressed tails for propulsion, which are not as deep as would be expected for an amphibious animal. They are also comparable to Sirenians in regards to their size and niche, as well as an adaptation to their aquatic lifestyle with placodont ribs, in general being thick and heavy, with those of Paraplacodus, a close relative, being distinct, as each has a prominent flange on the posterior margin that would have tightly overlapped the following rib and prevented a lateral undulation of the body. The presence of a prominent basket of gastralia and the other processes between the vertebrae that do not permit much motion indicates that Placodus and other Placodonts would have used their short limbs for manoeuvring and tails for propulsion, and weren't all that flexible otherwise. The pectoral and pelvic girdles are also composed of large flattened bones, and the bony contacts with the vertebral column appear to have been weak. Insertion scars for large muscles are also seen on the expanded heads of the proximal limb bones, with the hands and feet being short and wide, likely being paddle-like in life. Because of their dense bones, they likely do not exhibit lateral undulation, and due to being negatively buoyant, would have been too heavy to float in a pelagic environment, although this would allow them to have no problem in staying low on the seafloor to feed, which along with the types of sediments found accompanying their fossils, suggests that they lived in coastal, shallow waters, quite akin to modern hippos. Placodus also possessed a row of bony knobs above their backbone in the form of tubercles, and due to their more amphibious build, were likely capable of moving adequately on land, potentially spending a good deal of their time there and foraging in water when necessary. To date, nothing is known about placodont reproduction or sexual dimorphism, although it is feasible that they were egg layers. A study published in 2012 examined the brain case and inner ear of Placodonts to assess its aquatic lifestyle, which would help to resolve several questions, such as cranial altitudes and orientation, with the study identifying distinct semicircular canals, which allow them to assess the orientation of the lateral semicircular canal, which is key for balance and eye movements, which were shown to be dorsiventrally compressed and elongated, a commonly observed morphology of other marine reptiles. In addition, several other authors have argued that when the lateral semicircular canal is placed in a near horizontal orientation, the head is in an alert position, i.e. being ideally placed for an animal to be at its most alert and comfortable. What was found for Placodonts was an alert head position of around 20 degrees from the horizontal downwards. This finding has been interpreted as an adaptation for maximising the efficiency of binocular vision by dipping the head low to remove structures, such as their snout, from the field of view, as is the case in pterosaurs, owls and some theropod dinosaurs. It is however unlikely that Placodonts would have required unobstructed binocular vision anyway, as their food, as we'll get into, was sessile. An alternative interpretation is that this inclined posture would have been an adaptation for feeding in a three-dimensional aquatic environment, as has been supported, with the head at the level of the sea floor and the rest of the body further up in the water column at a 20-degree angle. This isn't to suggest that olfaction or other forms of chemosenses were not utilised, however, as the relative size of the nasal vestibulum, as well as the size of the olfactory bulbs, cannot be recovered on the specimen analysed in the study due to a lack of preservation of the anterior sphenoid bones. Due to the size of the nasopharyngeal canal, which extends over 50% of the skull's length, it may be possible that olfaction was used to some extent as well. Of course though, the most notable trace of Placodonts, as well as much of the other Placodonts, is their teeth, which give the group their name, and are key in determining their general diets. They are notable for possessing large, flat, and often protruding teeth, which from most studies are associated with the diets of marine bivalves, brachiopods, and other invertebrates, being key examples of gyrophagy, the eating behaviour of animals that consume hard-shelled or exoskeleton-bearing organisms. Placodont skulls in general were robust and housed rounded, flattened teeth borne on the maxillae, palatines and dentaries, with the examples I will mention making them one of the earliest and most extreme in terms of their specialisation to a gyrophagous diet of any known reptile group. Pronounced muscle attachment sites at the rear of the lower jaw, as well as on the pterygoids on the palate, the rear of which was positioned against the ventral elements of the brain case, and on the squamosals and the quadrates at the back of the skull, combined with the presence of a large coronoid process on the lower jaw, shows that rapid jaw opening, likely employed in suction feeding as will be covered soon, was useful in crushing their food, providing reinforcement for such processes. Placodonts, like the related Paraplacodonts, has 3 forward-pointing teeth in each premaxilla, which are robust and spatulate, which were likely used in plucking their benthic prey from substrates. The pavements of the teeth indicate that Placodonts would have crushed their prey by positioning them between the enormous palatal and mandibular teeth, then spitting out the bits of remaining shell and then consuming the soft parts. They have usually been regarded as predators of bivalves, but brachiopod fossils are also abundant at some Placodont-bearing localities, and broken masses of said shells have been regarded by some as the remains of Placodont meals. Because of this lifestyle, Placodonts have often been regarded as reptilian analogues of walruses. This is not entirely appropriate, however, as we now know that walruses do not crush their mollusk prey. It used to be thought to be that they did, but instead employ suction alone to remove the soft parts. Furthermore, it is incorrect to stereotype all Placodonts as bivalve or brachiopod eaters, because some Placodont taxa occur in strata where these invertebrates are all but absent. Decapod crustaceans are generally abundant in these cases, however. There are some who disagree with this diet, with a paper assessing their diets done by Kadjas Diedrich, stating that the jaw morphologies of 3 placodontid genera, Paraplacodus, Placodus, and Cymodontoids, were similar compared to those of dugongs and their ancestral relatives. Dugongs and Halotherium, an extinct dugonid, possess a horny oral pad and counterparts, as well as a specialised rasp-like tongue with which to grind seagrass and its roots, with a study comparing the structure to that observed in Placodonts, where something similar seemed to have been happening, with them possessing large teeth that covered the whole of their upper and lower jaws, forming a similar crushing or grinding pad that the study insists indicates a similar diet. Others have had disagreements with the findings of the study, stating that various other parts of Placodont anatomy are not consistent with the consumption of macroalgae on a consistent basis compared with shellfish. with many Placodonts having very large jaw adductors, as well as an expanded pterygoid flange of the palates that would have allowed for a very strong bite force, something not necessarily being needed for a diet primarily consisting of macroalgae. The large, broadened and flat teeth also typically only occur in animals that involve a large amount of mashing in their diet, with suckers and algae feeders, due to also reducing their dentition, tend to have a higher emphasis on certain jaw muscles and less so on others, and so their teeth tend to be either so underused for feeding that they are degenerate, or are specialised for acquisition rather than processing. While manatee teeth, for example, are low-crowned, broad, flat and high cusps, all the right conditions for tearing plant matter, they are not highly effective at it. Not that they need to be, given their food is stationary and not very hard to process. As will be discussed later, Placodonts also have different ways of shedding and replacing their teeth, something that wouldn't be all too necessary with a soft diet. One study compared the shapes of different Placodont teeth across different genera to test how efficient the teeth would break shells and how they resisted under pressure, with the study having the basic question of how well did they function, and did any genera achieve an optimal crushing tooth. Based on these models, Crofts and her team were able to predict that Placodonts should have evolved a slightly rounded tooth surface, which would break shells efficiently without damaging the tooth itself. While some later occurring Placodonts did just that, evolution equips the latest known occurrences of these creatures with teeth that had quite different and very intriguing characteristics. Many of the animals assessed did seem to achieve this optimal tooth shape, although one derived group, the Placochelyids, do something completely different. This group of Placodonts instead develops a complex tooth surface with a shallow, crescent-shaped furrow surrounding a small cusp on the principal crushing teeth, with the study suggesting that this tooth structure may have worked in a way similar to the function proposed for early hominin molars, with the furrow holding prey in place while the small cusp applies the force needed to break through the prey's shell. Furthermore, the study demonstrated that there was a slower rate of tooth replacement in this group of Placodonts, likely because changes in tooth shape protect the tooth from failure. The second group of Placodonts are the armoured cymodontoidea, being most notable for their extensive dermal armour that forms a complete dorsal shield or carapace, and some even possessed a ventral shield or plastron, giving them a remarkable resemblance to marine turtles. They are separated into three main families, being Cymodontidae, Placochelydae and Henodontidae. Being the first reptiles to evolve a bony shell, they would of course be compared to turtles, which would evolve soon after, although the similarities are convergent and they differ profoundly in their morphological details. Despite likely being pantestudines and sometimes even considered stem turtles, their shell structure was not homologous, with cymodontoids having hexagonal osteoderms on their dorsal surface that were tightly sutured to form their carapace, with some forms having a carapace consisting of two shields with one main one and a smaller posterior one covering the base of the tail, with some being solid or largely hollow. The evolution of this dermal armour could be down to increased predation pressure amongst these Placodont populations, as in the early Triassic, when the main predators of the time, being sharks, were generally large enough to fend them off, although as time passed, other marine reptiles would begin to colonise the seas, such as the first basal ichthyosaurs and nothosaurs, the latter of which have members with evidence of them feeding on these shelled Placodonts. By the late Triassic, as we'll get into, their shells had grown so much that some Placodont genera began to resemble even more so the sea turtles of modern day than their relatives without such armour. Cymodus is the main representative of the family Cymodontidae, with them having remarkable skulls which have been described as heart shapes, with its being antero-posteriorly short with a reduced snout and face, but also being unusually wide, having enormous supratemporal fenestrae which are usually more than twice as wide as the eye sockets. Their bodies were also broad and flattened, with their carapace being composed of hexagonal to subcircular osteoderms, and subconical osteoderms which also decorated the skull, limbs and tail, giving them a spiky look. Their tails exhibited rows of these scutes, with some forms having a stiff tail that was round in cross-section, and so could not have been much use in swimming. Because Cymodus had comparatively stronger limbs and a deeper body than the Placochelyds, which will be discussed later, it has been suggested that they may have been less bottom-dependent and more mobile than these forms, perhaps living in rougher waters in more rocky and turbulent environments. The second family, being Placochelydae, were in marked contrast to the short-snouted Cymodus, exclusively late Triassic members, and are united by an elongate rostrum that has a concave ventral surface and a reduced or absent dentition, like them overall having quite flattened triangular skulls. The best known and most derived members, being Placochelyid and Cephoderma, exhibit extensive carapaces, with the former being most similar of all Placodonts when it comes to appearing like modern sea turtles, having large, paddle-like limbs and short tails, although the claws would likely have been visible on the exterior. How Placochelyds lived and what they preyed on has been the subject of some debate, as since their long, slender rostrums do not seem powerful enough to have wrench-shelled invertebrates from hard surfaces, it is inferred that they would have instead probed for prey in soft sediments, similar to the niche eagle rays feel today, unearthing and eating buried bivalves or even pelagic crustaceans, which are more plentiful in their environment. In addition to the similarity to rays in the method of prey detection, they may have also hidden sediment away from predators, although due to their inflexible bodies and size, this may not be all too likely. Another advantage of the carapace, although not mutually exclusive, is the suggestion that the structure may have improved hydrodynamic efficiency. This appears most evident for the keel-shelled Cephoderma, with their being osteoderms with raised midline keels that form 3 distinct ridges that run the length of the carapace. These keels may have helped to control the flow of water around their bodies, streamlining them in making them more hydrodynamic, and making them faster and more stable while swimming. Their rostrum is another notable part of their anatomy, as unlike their more basal relatives, they lack premaxillary teeth, with their rostrum therefore being entirely toothless, instead with grooves running along the bottom of the structure, all the way from the tip to the internal nostrils on the palate. This implies that while probing through sediments aided by the sensitive rostrum, they would have inhaled water and tested it for olfactory clues, which has been recently proposed for plesiosaurs and may prove even more widespread in other groups. Once prey was detected, they may have then employed suction to get their prey into their mouths, and with them having large muscle attachments on the back of the skull and lower jaw, they could generate this suction simply by rapidly opening their jaws, something also inferred for placoderms like Dunkleosteus and other relatives. Placochelyid in particular has an extremely deep mandible, among the deepest of all Placodonts, largely owing to the extreme development of its coronoid process, which in most Placodonts is composed of the dentary and surangula, with a mesial contribution of the coronoid bone, whereas it is entirely made up of the coronoid in this genus, which is deeply edged with muscle attachment sites. In addition, the dentition is amazingly inset from the lateral jaw margin by clear lateral ridges on both the upper and lower jaws, mimicking the inset buccal margins in mammals. This may therefore imply that the jaws had a more rostral muscular setup as in mammals, or a pseudomasseter as in birds such as parrots. The third family, Henodontidae, is the most turtle-like, but also the most unusual, with the main representative, Henodus, having many unique characteristics and anatomy that really makes them stand out among other Placodonts. They possess a notable, overly wide, square, and a seemingly winged carapace, as well as proportionally short limbs, although something equally interesting was going on with their skulls. The skull of Henodus is surreal, with them possessing a broad, squared-off rostrum, hyper-shortened preorbital region and broad, flat skull table, with the nostrils and orbits being located close to the snout tip. The skull, also being curved when viewed from the side, also shows that both these features faced upwards. Henodus as a genus is also unique in lacking supratemporal fenestrae, which is secondarily roofed over, with the skull therefore being more solid and unfenestrated, with the lower jaw also being surprisingly deep and heavy, although their low coronoid process indicates that they do not have the same crushing bites of other cymodontoids. However, features indicative of musculature allowing for rapid jaw opening are present, while prominent hyoid bones imply that Henodus had a distendable throat that will be relevant in the following segment, being their diet. Given all of these unique features, how and what Henodus ate has always been controversial, with them having fewer teeth than any other Placodont, with only 4 in total, one pair of small teeth being located on the palatine bones and another on the dentaries. The skull is also notable in having gutter-like grooves running along the edges of the upper and lower jaws, with the rediscovery in the 1990s of striations within said jaw grooves, indicating that Henodus had baleen-like material fringing its jaws. Furthermore, long overlooked is that the premaxillae supports a ventrally projecting flange, with a sharp cutting edge, and most surprisingly of all, that this cutting edge exhibits a row of tooth-like denticles along its anterior surface. When considered together and compared with the feeding adaptations of turtles, these features suggest that Henodus was a filter feeder that employed depression of the heavy lower jaw and expansion of the throat to suck in food particles. They may have engulfed swimming invertebrates, filtered burrowing forms out from the substrates, or used the premaxillary flange and denticles to scrape algae off rocks, or to cut off pieces of other kinds of aquatic vegetation. But there is more, including a suggestion that rather than a long bank of filter-feeding features of the jaws, Henodus cheliops was a suction feeder. Features alluding to this are numerous, including a well-developed hyoid apparatus, a broad, flat rostral face, and a high vaulting of the palate, with short, deep jaws with rostral insertions of the mandible for the mandibular adductor muscles, which would lead to a sort of pseudo-cheek and provide a large oral cavity. It is quite likely then, like the Massa, but then also like the extant walrus or the vaguely walrus-like cetacean, Ardurbanosatops, would have been a hunter of buried, sessile prey. An absence of strong crushing teeth, limited to a small pair of elongated flat teeth on each jaw, suggests indeed that little oral processing occurred and that food was swallowed directly, even if it was strained from the water through the baleen-like plates fixed within grooves in the upper and lower jaws. There is also evidence for Henodus in being further unique in being the only Placodonts known to have inhabited a non-marine environment, as the region where they are from in southern Germany is believed to represent a semi-enclosed brackish lagoon, based on the sediment types present and the geology of the area. The presence of a turtle-like shell also has other interesting points, as modern turtles with hard shells are known to be extremely resistant to fluctuations in salinity compared to other amphibious reptiles, as the shell can act as a superb osmotic barrier, supported by the location of where Henodus have been preserved, as these brackish lagoon areas would have been subjected to influxes of fresh water and to marginal desiccation, resulting in extreme hypersalinity. This idea of tolerant placodonts is also supported by the longevity of cymodontoids compared to other Triassic marine reptile lineages, as while many others became extinct at the end of the Carnian, related perhaps to a series of marine transgressions and regressions, cymodontoids persisted as late as the Ratian. Until rather recently, the evolution of placodonts was still rather unclear, as while these more derived forms were known of, their most basal forms were still unknown of until now. The most basal placodont known, being described in 2013, is Placodonta, from the early Middle Triassic of the Netherlands, with the specimen being described being a juvenile, with a skull 2 cm in size, being well preserved and allowing for characteristics to be identified in comparing this animal to its later relatives. The specimen lacks the broad flat teeth of their later relatives, with them being small, sharp and peg-like, double-rowed as well as on the upper jaw, which proves their classification, which seem to be best suited for gripping much softer and active prey. A new clade was also erected named the Placodontiforms, that includes this basal genus, also shedding light on the debate of where the group originated, with earlier findings suggesting either present-day China or Europe. This finding therefore indicates that the group originated in the Western Tethys in Europe and then expanded east, keeping to nearshore environments in turn, with Placodonta overall, providing insights both into the evolution of placodont dentition, representing a transitional morphology. They have also cleared up geographic origin as well. The change in morphology from group to group of their tooth structure over time is also quite interesting, with them getting flatter the further removed species are from their common ancestor with other Sauropterygians, with their tooth number and replacement following a phylogenetic trend. In the earliest forms, in the case of Placodus and Paraplacodus, the number of teeth in the tooth row is high, with even the palatine bone being almost completely covered by teeth, creating a uniform breaking surface. Many specimens also showcase many replacement teeth at various stages of growth, with little or no discernible pattern, likely due to the increased wear from hard-shelled prey. On the other hand, the more derived cymodontoids tend to have fewer replacement teeth growing at any one time, with many losing their premaxillary teeth, replacing them unilaterally and/or in functional units, thus maintaining at least one functional crushing area at all times, with Placochelyids having even fewer teeth, only having 1 or 2 replacement teeth in the upper jaw, allowing them to maintain the ability to crush prey items on at least one side of the mouth at any time, a method not seen in any other reptile group. This therefore supports previous suggestions that these taxa had an alternative diet to other placodonts, i.e. crustaceans. Because placodonts are the sister group to all other Sauropterygians, this data is of great comparative and phylogenetic significance, providing key insights into some of the morphological and functional changes that occurred on the stem leading to more derived Sauropterygians. Their extinction at the end of the Triassic can be placed down to numerous factors, such as the extinction event that happened at the end of the period and perhaps even competition with other aquatic sauropsodons. There is a report of a lower Jurassic Placodont, a single tooth, described in 1931, although this specimen is thought to have been reworked from Triassic strata, although thinking about what could have been for the group had they persisted would be a great source of speculative evolution. All in all, I thank you for watching this video on these animals and that you may have learned something new. If you would like to see more from this channel, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and with that, I'll see you next time, whenever that may be.